So you'll hear me use a lot of Spanish examples in class because we are in Texas. Many people here know Spanish, and I've studied it a lot. In fact, I used to teach English as a second language to Spanish speakers, so you'll hear me talk about that. I already have today. But for those of you who have studied Spanish, you can see there are a lot of similar words in English, and the reason why is this is from the time England was ruled by Rome. Words like interesante in Spanish is obviously interesting in English, where diferente is different. This comes from the mix of Old English and Latin that happened during and after Roman rule in England. So, the Romans went away, and for over 500 years, the Old English and Latin intertwined and mixed with each other. Then in 1066, William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel with a bunch of dudes and conquered. Big surprise, right? Someone called William the Conqueror conquered. Well, William was Norman. Has anyone heard of Normandy? Stephen? The beaches of Normandy were where the American forces landed on D-Day in World War II. Normandy is in France. The Normans were just like the other tribes, like the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, but they spoke an entirely different language, French. William the Conqueror really kicked butt. I mean, he kicked butt hard. The Anglo-Saxons were very soon under the rule of French-speaking Normans. Now French was very close to Latin. So French is very close to Latin. That's why it's called a Romantic language. It's not because girls go, oh, when you speak French and swoon. It's because it's Latin-based, as in Romantic, as in Rome. Spanish is the same way. Spanish, English, Italian, or Spanish, French, Italian. Those are Romantic languages. So people in England knew some Latin, so some of the words they may have been recognizable to them, right? They'd been under Roman rule before. But the Normans saw the Anglo-Saxon barbarian dudes as filthy peasants because they were. And for hundreds of years, kings and queens and all the other nobles in England, which means anyone who had land, money, or power, all spoke French. And that's right, the king and queen of England did not speak English for hundreds of years. English was the language of the peasant boys who spent all day shoveling horse doo-doo. So while under the rule of the Normans, English got a huge influx of French words. Over 15,000, I believe, French words are in English, and other words derived from French. So words like garbage, ballet, buffet, faux pas, à la mode, attaché, au contraire, bon appétit, brunette. These are all French words and terms that you probably know what they mean. Not to mention a grande mocha latte or anything else you can order at Starbucks, which actually might be Italian. But anyway, because French was the language of the nobles, all the rich people, even today, English speakers tend to think of French as being fancy. Like, I don't know if I have a teacup here, but I would drink it with my pinky raised if I were French, right? So, skipped ahead. So here you can see on this pie chart that influences on English. About 30% is from the Germanic Old English, from barbarian dudes, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes. 30% from Latin that came from the Roman rule and stuck around. And then 30% from French, which was based on Latin, that came from the Normans. So this is why English is a mongrel mutt of a language, and that's why there are so many oddities and exceptions in it. Like the term where. Where is a root word, W-E-R-E, and the only place it exists in English today is in the word werewolf. It is an Old English root word that meant man. So werewolf, man-wolf. But that's the only place it exists. So if you, as learning English, you could see how there's nothing to do. That's very difficult. Anyway, I'm skipping ahead. So, for hundreds of years, peasants speaking English and anyone worth anything speaking French. There are hundreds of years of this, right? So don't get me wrong, though. The nobles could speak English. They learned it so they could tell their servants to fetch them more crumpets, but they didn't like speaking English because it was dirty. Nobles in that time could pretty much speak every language. In fact, Charles V, this is later, in the 16th century, famously said, "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." So that's kind of the hierarchy of languages to Charles V. English isn't even on that list. Okay, he might speak to his dog in English, but He spoke English. Anyway, so nobody wrote anything in English because the people that spoke English couldn't read it. They couldn't read. Back then, nobody could read. The Bible was in Latin, and the church, which remember was the Catholic Church because they were the only Christian church at this time, they held Mass in Latin, and part of the priest's job was to tell the people what they thought the Bible said, because it was written in Latin. So then a guy by the name of Geoffrey Chaucer decided to write in English. Of course, he spoke other languages. Chaucer had traveled Europe and could speak French, Latin, and maybe even Italian and German. Chaucer decided to write in English, and the Canterbury Tales is one of the first and definitely most important works that has now become Middle English. Right now we're in Middle English, and we study Middle English with this. This is what Middle English looks like. I will attempt to read this as an excerpt from The Knight's Tale, which is the Canterbury Tales. So, Wilhelm, as old stories tell us, there was a duke that hight Theseus. Of Athens he was lord and governor, and in his time such a conqueror, that greater was there none under the sun. Okay, now, pronunciation, I'm guessing on most of that, right? That's how Old English would probably sound. You can notice that, so it's like a completely different language. Old English was like a completely different language. Remember the Beowulf. But here is Middle English. We can see that we recognize a lot of the words, even if the spellings are not the same. So spelling was not something people agreed upon back then. There was no such thing as a dictionary where everyone agreed on how to spell words. So that happened later with the printing press. So there is there. Duke, like D-U-K is duke. Height is a word that meant named. Time is time, of course. Switch is such, S-U-C-H. Greater is greater, right? We spell it with an A now. Noon under the sun is none under the sun. So, whilome, I believe, is a word that's like meanwhile, or there once was, like once upon a time. Whilome, once upon a time, as old stories tell us, there was a duke named Theseus of Athens. He was lord and governor, and in his time such a conqueror that greater was there none under the sun. Basically says there was this guy named Theseus, and he was a cool dude. All right. This is Middle English. And then, finally, we have Modern English. This is what we speak today. This is one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and I'll let you read it for yourself. So if Shakespeare uses a lot of flowery language, a lot of big words that you may not know, and thee and thou and knowest and things like that. And he even invented over 2,000 words. Words like dawn, arouse, obscene, laughable, moonbeam, savagery, luggage, label, gossip, radiance, torture, champion, buzzer, bedroom, addiction, and bloodstained. He invented all those words. So when Shakespeare didn't have a word, and Shakespeare, of course, could also speak French and probably Latin and many other things, when he couldn't find a word, he would just make one up. He'd take pieces of other words and put them together. So there's that. So the reason English is so important is because of the British Empire, the largest empire that history has ever known. That tiny little country the size of Alabama, named after a barbarian tribe, became the largest colonial power in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's why English is spoken in almost every country in the world. You can see the British Empire at its peak. Because after the British Empire, now we have the American Empire, which has taken the form of international corporations. If I asked you why you were in college, you would probably say something like, because I want to get a good job when I graduate. Well, guess who has all the good jobs? Companies like these. Vodafone, Kellogg's, Microsoft, Sharp, HP. Okay? Companies like these. These are companies that have offices in New York, Dubai, London, Beijing, Paris, Delhi. The workers in the offices of most of these companies have one thing in common. All of their formal business communications are conducted in standard American English, not Huntsville, Texas English, not slang or language that's for real dog or from the streets or based on texting. The best jobs, the kind where you can make a ton of money and or do really important work, will expect you to be able to communicate properly in standard American English. That is what I'm attempting to teach you in this class. So true, You can just skate by in this class and not try very hard and maybe pass, but what I'm teaching you can one day mean the difference in the number of zeros on the end of your paycheck. Because the first time you send in a resume or email or type up a report that is full of incomplete sentences, bad grammar, and slang, you will be labeled as someone who cannot communicate in standard American English, and it might not get you fired, but it will mean that there will only be so far up the corporate ladder that you can go. No one wants their company to be full of people who can't communicate in writing. SHSU is a big criminal justice school. I always in class like to ask how many CJ majors there are in the class, and I always get a few hands. Most of the CJ majors, when asked what they want to do, will say they want to be FBI agents, like they see on TV. Then on their first paper, they use the letter U instead of typing out the word Y-O-U. They say things like, and this actually happened once, for real, and things like I seen it, which should be I saw it or I have seen it. And they want to be FBI agents. Most of you will laugh and say, whatever, Quarles, no one cares if you use correct grammar, and you might be right. You might live your whole life using your terrible grammar and never notice any problems. But do you think the Federal Bureau of Investigation would hire you if you spoke and or wrote like that? Do any of you want to go to graduate school, become doctors, or especially lawyers? Do you want to one day run a successful business or run, for president? Okay? Most of all those professions, all other professions that pay the most, require the most paperwork. If you are unable to use standard American English, then those dreams are just a puff of smoke. Well, that's enough preaching for today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson on the history of the English language, and we'll see you next time.